Hi, I'm Chris Santomassimo from OGC Solutions, and what I'd like to talk about today is something that's on everyone's mind right now, which is the recession. Some people are discussing a recession that's in the future, others believe it's already started, but employers around the country are taking stock of their workforces and thinking about what do they need to do in order to prepare for what might be a bumpy road later this year. I think we've seen a number of companies like Google this morning announce that it's freezing new hires. Other companies have already done reductions in force like Tesla. And I think we see a lot in our mid-market clients the same kind of concerns. So I've written an article on our website in the OGC Think Factory about the top items to consider when you're going to come upon a reduction in force. But here are some of the highlights which would go in tandem with the article. You know, as you start to think about a reduction in force, the place to start is to have a view of your entire workforce. Create some sort of a report or a chart that lists all of your employees by work site, by position, by department, and give yourself a sort of a 360 view of your workforce, which will enable you to make more informed decisions about where to trim, how to trim, and who's impacted. The second thing is as you look at your roster and start to make decisions about who's impacted by a reduction in force, think about how you're going to document and explain each of the selections, especially those selections that you make based on employee performance. What we find a lot of times is that employers don't do a good job on a day-to-day basis of documenting performance concerns, and it's difficult to explain on a retroactive basis. So be sure that your risk assessment, which we'll talk about in a second, is going to include an explanation of who's impacted by your reduction in force. Number three, a risk assessment. I can't stress enough how important a risk assessment is when you're doing a reduction in force, because what you want to do is look at all of the impacted employees and on a case-by-case basis determine whether there are any risk factors that would cause you to pause, maybe document the reasons why that person was selected. In particular, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a lot of claims around the idea of whistleblowers, that is, people who complained about conditions in the workplace during COVID-19 sometimes find themselves, or at least they believe they find themselves, cloaked in whistleblower protected status. So be sure that you're analyzing who may have raised concerns or issues or complaints during the pandemic or otherwise, and factor that into your risk analysis. And you know, at the risk of sounding a little self-serving, I would tell you that this is a thing to do with your legal counsel who understands your workforce, your business, and make sure that these risk factors are handled. Number four, notice periods and the WARN Act. So the WARN Act is a federal statute that governs mass layoffs and plant closures. So if either of those things are within your plan for a reduction in force, you need to keep in mind the WARN Act and whether it's triggered, because it requires you to give at least 60-day notice to those impacted employees. Keep in mind that many states have their own mini-WARN statutes, which lower the thresholds in terms of the number of people impacted by a reduction in force, and also provide, in some cases, longer notice periods. So again, this is another thing that you think about in the course of your planning. If you're going to trigger WARN or the mini-WARN statutes in your state, you need to give the proper notice, not only to impacted employees, but certain government agencies as well. Number five, if your company has a unionized workforce in any location, know your labor agreement. Your collective bargaining agreement is going to have provisions about how people are laid off, in what order, and maybe also include severance provisions for impacted employees. So not only understanding your collective bargaining agreement is important, but also having a communication with the union representatives as you lead up to your reduction in force. These types of communications and doing things the proper way under the contract will minimize the grievances that you see as a result of a reduction in force. Number six is a communication plan. No matter whether you're unionized or not, you need a communication plan. On top of the concerns that I mentioned earlier about WARN notices, making sure that you can communicate to your workforce, not only the people impacted, but those employees who will remain after the reduction in force is really important. to stabilize your workforce, explain the reasons why you did a reduction in force, and get your people focused on business going forward after the reduction in force. Mystery is not good in these scenarios. And then lastly, following state rules about your last payroll timing. So there are certain states like Massachusetts and California, as only two examples, that require the employer to make the final payroll payment on the last day worked. So you don't just go to the next payroll period to make that final paycheck. That check has to be delivered electronically or in paper form on the last day of employment. So this is part of your planning, is to make sure that you can time appropriately and make sure that you've got paychecks ready for the impacted employees. So these are only the top 7 things that we think about in reductions in force. There are many other issues that come up in the course of discussing a reduction in force and planning for it, writing the notices, and executing in a proper way. This is the type of thing that you need your general counsel or your outside general counsel, in our case, to partner with you to make sure that you've covered all these bases. If you're thinking about a reduction in force, we'd be happy to discuss with you how these factors apply to your company and your workforces and help you plan in an appropriate way. Thanks a lot for visiting ogcsolutions.com, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.